Echoes in the Mist, an illustrated history of the Niagara Falls area. Chapter 1. Distant Thunder. Ceaselessly, endlessly, the wide green river hurls itself into the abyss. Churned by the drops and eddies of rock-studded rapids, its waters come at last to a final, awesome plunge, arcing gracefully into a broad wall of white before cascading nearly 170 feet into the deep pools of the Niagara Gorge below. 300 years and more have passed since Europeans first heard the distant thunder of the falling stream. Untold generations since the first Native Americans peered with wonder from the bordering forests to see the plunge of the bright waters. But time means little to the river. 1.5 million gallons of water reach the brink of the falls each second. As a huge heartland drainage basin feeds 1/5 of all the world's fresh surface water through the Great Lakes and toward the river and its cataracts. Each second, more than 2,800 tons of water hit the surface of the river at the base of the Horseshoe Falls, and more than 300 tons cascade down the rocks below the American and Bridal Veil Falls, before joining turbulent pools as deep as the falls are high. Parkland now lines the boiling rapids, and cities stand atop the high rock walls of the gorge that straddles a peaceful border between two nations. To the river, it is all one with the alarms of war and the bustlings of industry that have marked humanity's few centuries along its banks. Timeless and hypnotic, the river thunders over the Niagara Falls. In thousands of years, it has carved a 7.5-mile path through the rock of the Niagara Escarpment. Left to itself, it would take thousands of years more to crumble into a long series of rapids from Lake Erie to the lower river and Lake Ontario. Humanity has slowed its progress, diverting water for hydropower and cutting the rate of erosion to a mere foot or so each year. Change was once more rapid. The falls of 12,000 years ago, when the first nomadic hunters reached the Niagara frontier, as the last of the Ice Age glaciers retreated northward, was one of at least 5 major spillways draining a now vanished ancient lake. Only the Niagara River survived, and where it met the 300-foot Niagara Escarpment at what is now Lewiston, New York, a massive waterfall was formed. By the time of Abraham, it had formed a whirlpool at a bend where an even older river once had flowed. Through the days of Aristotle and Jesus Christ, it was cutting the rock walls that now mark the edge of the city of Niagara Falls. Some 900 years ago, the single Niagara Falls neared yet another turn in the channel. The cataract bowed and broke. The American Falls thundered its separate way down the side of the gorge, as the Horseshoe Falls continued its slow recession. Soon, in geological time, the larger cataract eroded its way past Luna Island, and the American Falls' smaller sister, the Luna or Bridal Veil Falls, was born. 400 years ago, the cataracts looked much as they do today. The large landmass of Goat Island separated the 800-foot wide American Falls and the 100-foot wide Bridal Veil Falls from the Horseshoe, which was straighter than its current 2,500-foot crescent, but still carried 90% of the river's flow. To that wonder, at the beginning of the 17th century, came the first of the white men. Samuel de Champlain, exploring, quote, New France, unquote, as his king sought an ice-free northern route to the Orient, was the first to report hearing tales of Niagara's wonders, but there is no evidence he ever saw the cataracts. In his De Savages, published in Paris in 1604, and based on accounts he received from Indians in the New World the year before, Champlain provides only sketchy descriptions of the Great Lakes and the large waterfalls. Etienne Brulé, woodsman and interpreter for Champlain, may have been the first European actually to set foot in the Niagara region. On his way to the Andaste Indian Territory in the Susquehanna Valley in 1615. He also may have been the first non-Indian to see the falls. Legend says the young Coureur de Bois, or woods runner, made his way to the cataract despite the desertion of Indian guides who featured to enrage the spirit of the thundering waters. But there is no proof. Next came the seekers of souls, the French missionaries to the Hurons, who reached at least the region of the falls and heard of its wonders. The Recollect priest Joseph de la Roche de Leon and two companions journeyed to the Niagara frontier in 1626, spending 3 months in the region west of the Niagara River in an attempt to convert Indians of the neuter or neutral nation. The Jesuit missionaries Jean de Brebeuf and Pierre Cheminot journeyed to the area in the winter of 1640-41, and in 41, Reverend Jerome Lallemant wrote to his Jesuit superior of a river called Anguiahara that carried the waters of Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. A doctor, Le Sieur Gendron, wrote in 1614 of Erie's flow, quote, from a terrible height, unquote, into Lake Ontario over falls whose spray deposited a yellowish salt of medicinal value. The falls also carried enough animals to their deaths, he noted, to provide plentiful food for the natives living nearby. But it was a Sulpician missionary, the scholarly Father René de Bonfant de Galinée, who left the most tantalizing early account in 1669 during a journey with the 6.5-foot tall Father Francois Dollier de Casson, who was an ex-cavalry captain famed for his ability to hold a seated man in each of his outstretched hands, and the yet unsung 27-year-old explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle. Galinée reached the mouth of the Niagara River and heard the distant thunder of the falls, yet apparently wasn't curious enough to travel inland for a look at what the Indians' descriptions convinced him must be, quote, one of the finest cataracts or waterfalls in the world, unquote. Quote, all the Indians to whom I have spoken about it say the river fell in that place from a rock higher than the tallest pines, that is, about 200 feet, unquote. He wrote in a remarkably accurate estimate. Quote, in fact, we heard it from where we were. But this fall gives such an impulse to the water that, although we were 10 or 12 leagues away, the water is so rapid that one can, with great difficulty, row up against it. Our desire to go to our little village called Ganastago, Sanatua, Otoanatua prevented our going to see that wonder." Unquote. LaSalle went on to explore the Ohio River, and Galenay and Cassan eventually camped on the shores of Lake Erie and formally claimed the entire region for Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, all without bothering to see the falls. In the annals of Niagara, the incurious Galenay becomes a footnote, leaving center stage to a colorful and controversial Recollect missionary known as Father Louis Hennepin, the first European known to actually have seen the falls. Hennepin, who perhaps loved to excite men's imaginations as well as he liked saving their souls, reached the Niagara 9 years after Galenay, on St. Nicholas Day, December 6, in 1678, as a member of LaSalle's second North American exploration. With Indian guides, he set out on foot for the falls. Quote, 4 leagues from Lake Frontenac, Ontario, there is an incredible cataract, or waterfall, which has no equal, unquote. He wrote in 1683 in what became the most widely read work on America in that century. Quote, the Niagara River near this place is only 1/8 of a league wide, but it is very deep in places, and so rapid above the Great Fall that it hurries down all animals which try to cross it, without a single one being able to withstand its current. They plunge down a height more than 500 feet, and its falls is composed of 2 sheets of water and a cascade, with an island sloping down. In the middle of these waters foam and boil in a fearful manner. Quote, they thunder continually, and when the wind blows in a southerly direction, the noise which they make is heard for more than 15 leagues. Unquote. Hennepin, whose later accounts became less trustworthy, and who was not averse to claiming exploratory credit, perhaps more rightly due to LaSalle, was a little off his estimate of the fall's height, unless you count the depth of the cliffs underwater. But his is the first eyewitness account and the most detailed description of the falls region up to that time. Even if later editions of his books did increase the height of the awesome cataracts to, quote, 600 foot or more, unquote, the missionary who said the first Catholic Mass in Niagara region on December 11th, 1678, described the portage around 2 leagues of river rapids at the falls as, quote, a very fine road, very little wood, and almost all prairies mingled with some oaks and firs on both sides of the banks of the river, which are of a height that inspire fear when you look down, unquote. Henry de Tonty, LaSalle's lieutenant, visited the falls about 2 months later and agreed with Hennepin's height estimates. Quote, I can say that it is the most beautiful fall in the world, unquote, he wrote some 5 years later. Quote, our estimate, it falls perpendicularly 500 feet and is some 200 toises wide. It throws off vapors which may be seen at a distance of 16 leagues, and it may be heard at the same distance when it is calm. When once the swans and bustards are caught in its current, it is impossible for them to take flight again, and they are dead before they go to the bottom of the fall." Unquote. Hennepin and Tonty were at Niagara Falls because La Salle was burning with the desire to forge a major fur trading route into the continental heartland he had probed. Part of that scheme involved a fleet of ships to ply the waters of this land of broad lakes and rivers, and a ship would be indeed built just above Niagara Falls to open those routes. Hennepin, a priest with a decidedly secular bent, and Tonty, known to fearful Indians as, quote, "the man with the iron hand," unquote, for the metal replacement for an appendage lost in a battle in Sicily, were part of that expedition. And Hennepin and a few companions from the expedition's advance party made the first journey by canoe and foot to see the falls. The wilderness wasn't the only problem for the French explorers. There was unrest, too, among the Indians of the region. The Niagara region, when Europeans arrived, was controlled by the Seneca Nation of the Great Iroquois Confederation. It had been gained by the Senecas through warfare and assimilation of conquered tribes, among them the Neutral, the Erie, the Tobacco, and the Huron nations. The Senecas are the, quote, "keepers of the western door," unquote, for the Six Nation Iroquois Confederation. And they had helped push the earlier tribes of Algonquin stock northward into Canada. The Hurons, part of the even larger but more loosely organized Wyandot Confederacy, held sway beyond the Niagara to the northwest when Europeans arrived. And there was enmity between the two nations. When La Salle arrived to open his trade routes, the Senecas were already engaged in moving furs to Albany for trade with the British. To both the Indians and the Europeans, it was obvious that control of the Niagara meant control of the fur trade, and the French sought to convince the doubtful Senecas that their arrival in the region meant trade opportunities. The Senecas were unschooled, but not unwise. They were part of a confederation that was to provide a model for the Albany draft document that became a precursor to the United States Constitution and eventually to the Constitution itself. They were wary of all Europeans, but were well aware of the power inherent in the prospects of trade. After visits from the French to Seneca settlements near Rochester, first by Hennepin and Dominic de la Motte Lesueur, and shortly after by La Salle and Tonty, the Indian leaders gave the explorers grudging permission to build a ship, strictly for exploration, near the falls. Of even more lasting importance, they also agreed to let the French erect a warehouse at the mouth of the river on Lake Ontario. The ship was called the Griffin, the first large vessel to sail the upper lakes. La Salle led the French in January of 1679 up the Niagara Escarpment and past the falls to the banks of the Cayuga Creek. Oaks were felled, and shipwrights, their temporary huts, the first European settlement in Niagara Falls, spent February and half of March building a 45-ton sailing vessel. Traveling back to the mouth of the river, La Salle began work on his, quote, warehouse, unquote. Actually, 2 stone block houses to be called Fort Conti. The Senecas, however, were perhaps even more uneasy about the strange vessel taking shape near what is now Griffin Park in Niagara Falls. They stopped bringing corn to trade to the Frenchmen, and only the hunting done by friendly Mohicans kept the Frenchmen's larders stocked. Soon, the Seneca warriors were plotting to burn the new vessel, but the French, warned by an Indian woman, foiled the plot. Father Hennepin blessed the ship in mid-March and set off down the lakes on its maiden voyage. Strapped for cash and unable to buy supplies on credit, La Salle violated the terms of the agreement once more by loading a cargo of furs at Green Bay. While he stayed to push inland, eventually following the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico before dying in Texas, the Griffin set sail for Niagara, never to be seen again. Fort Conte fared little better, burning to the ground after less than a year. It would be replaced in 1687 by the buildings of tiny Fort Denonville, but that too would also last less than a year. It was built by an expedition led by Jacques-René de Brissac, Marquis de Denonville, and among the members of that troop was the first non-priest to write of Niagara Falls, Louis Armand de Lame d'Acre, Baron Lahontan, in fact, was very much a non-priest, satirical, loose with the facts, adventurous, and military. Quote, "As for the waterfall of Niagara," unquote, he wrote in a book translated into English in 1703, quote, "'Tis 700 or 800 foot high, and a half league broad. Towards the middle of it we descry an island that leans towards the precipice, as if it were ready to fall. All the beasts that cross the water within half a quarter of a league above this unfortunate island are sucked in by the force of the stream, and the beasts and fish are thus killed by the prodigious fall. Serve food to 50 Iroquois who are settled about 2 leagues off, and take them out of the water with their canoes," unquote. More than exploration was afoot in the New World in these years. France and England were at each other's throats in a series of wars that would span the next century. While armies battled in Europe and navies clashed on the seas, the vortex of war drew in the soldiers of the New World frontiers and the Indian nations who dealt with them. In general, the Senecas supported the British and the Hurons the French. Early in, quote, King William's War, unquote, the earliest of the conflicts, Senecas from the Niagara region captured a 17-year-old soldier named Louis Thomas de Joncaire. Joncaire, later Sieur de Chabert, was a native of Provence, France, but had been in Canada since his boyhood. By his own account, his life was spared in admiration for the way he resisted attempts to prepare him for burning at the stake. While his companions who begged for mercy were tortured to death, Joncaire knocked down an old chief who tried to burn his finger in a bowl of a smoking pipe. For his spunk, the young soldier was adopted into the tribe and given an Iroquois wife. Joncaire was to live among the Senecas for years and to have a decided impact upon the region's history. Through him, many Senecas would be won to the French side. his knowledge of the Seneca language would prove of immeasurable value to French trade hopes, and his sons Philippe and Daniel would also win the trust of the Native Americans. The Jonquières would be major factors in the region's century of French domination. In 1720, Jonquière won permission from the Senecas to build a trading post near Niagara Falls. His bark cabin, built at the foot of the Niagara Escarpment in what is now Art Park at Lewiston, was the first house in the area. Jonquière's Mill, built later by his son Daniel along the shoreline just above the American Falls, would be the first such device to harness the power of the river. Jonquière's trading post was built at the northern end of the portage route, where Hennepin, the other early explorers, and the Indians before them had landed to continue the journey upriver on foot. The portage led them from the low and relatively level fields near the landing up the steep, three-tiered face of the escarpment itself, and then paralleled the gorge to an upper river landing above the falls. A year or two before the post was built, an unknown French officer passed through the region and recorded a scene at what would become Lewiston and Niagara Falls. The Niagara Portage is 2.5 leagues to 3 leagues long, but the road over which carts roll 2 or 3 times a year is very fine, with very beautiful and open woods through which a person is visible for a distance of 60 paces. The trees are all oaks and very large. The soil along the entire length of that road is not very good. From the landing, which is 3 leagues up the river, 4 hills are to be ascended. Above the first hill, there is a Seneca village, about 10 cabins, where Indian corn, beans, peas, watermelons, and pumpkins are raised, all of which are very fine. These Seneca are employed by the French, from whom they earn money by carrying the goods of those who are going to the upper country for some metastases, leggings, others for shirts, some for powder and ball, whilst some others pilfer. And on the return of the French, they carry their sacks of furs for some peltry. This portage is made for the purpose of avoiding the cataract of Niagara, the grandest sheet of water in the world, having a perpendicular fall of 200 or 300 feet. The importance of the portage, which traversed what is now the downtown area of the city of Niagara Falls, has been dimmed by the passage of centuries. In early America, it was the absolute key to control the interior and of the lucrative trade in beaver pelts. Whoever held the route along the 36-mile Niagara River held the upper hand, militarily and economically, in the development of vast stretches of the continent. Niagara, the survivor of a magnitude of spellings of an Indian word that most probably meant, quote, the neck, unquote, was a poor region to settle. Otherwise, the portage trail led through land partly forested with oak, pine, and other trees, with the greatest profusion of plant life in the unique environment of the gorge and the spray from the falls, but the soil was generally considered indifferent for farming. The falls' reputation as a natural wonder was growing, but the commerce kept Niagara on the map. Joncair's palisaded trading post stood on the site of what once had been a neutral Indian village, and near the place where a hut storehouse built by La Salle once stood. It was the start of the Indian portage route followed by Father Hennepin half a century before, and followed since by other Europeans, shifting cargo and military forces between Lake Erie and Ontario. The location gave Joncaire virtual control over the trade route until his death in 1739, and he used trade goods as currency to hire Indians to carry loads of material up the steep escarpment between the landings. But the importance of his post pales in comparison to the other concession he gained from the Senecas: permission to build a stone, quote, house of peace, unquote, for trade purposes at the mouth of the river. The stone house occupied the ground at Lake Ontario shoreline once occupied by Fort Conty and Fort Denonville, but it was to last much longer. Despite bombardment, age, neglect, occupation by troops of 3 nations, and finally, the attention of tourists, the, quote, French castle, unquote, still stands today as the centerpiece of Fort Niagara and is the oldest building in the Great Lake Basin, perhaps the oldest between the Appalachians and Mississippi. Construction was started in 1726 and finished in 1727, giving the French a firm hold on the strategic strait. The British, who had been hundreds of miles to the east and had only pushed inland as far as Albany in the time of La Salle, had to continue themselves with Lake Ontario trade through a portage at Oswego, or the costly, lengthy journey across the Appalachian Mountains farther south. English protest against the French fort went unheeded, as the tensions unresolved by King William's War and Queen Anne's War early in the century built towards the mid-century conflict known as King George's War. The flow of trade, goods, and furs through Fort Niagara, more of a guard post than a trading center, kept building, and the portage became ever more valuable. In 1751, 3 years after King George's War, the French built, quote, Little Fort Niagara, unquote, at the head of the portage in what is now Niagara Falls, to protect that end of the route and keep Indians from the upper lakes by bypassing the main fort to reach the British Trade Center at Oswego. Arriving in New France that year was one J.C. Bonifans, a gunner who in the spring of 1753 found himself en route over the portage with an expedition taking provisions, ammunition, and trade goods to Lake Erie. He used the occasion to descend into the gorge at the falls, despite the objections of his companions. Quote, Presently I began to descend with the intention of making sure of the branches which I encountered on my way, descending backwards so that I would not let go one after another until I had seized others of the same firmness, unquote. He wrote, quote, I was about an hour in getting down, not with commending myself to Providence, for I perceived the rashness of my undertaking. But I had to finish as much from pride as from curiosity, unquote. Bonifans reached the foot of the falls and made his way across the rocks to a cavern behind the falling
wall of water. Blocked by crevices, he retreated. Quote, all shivering with cold and drenched, I hastened to take again the road by which I had descended, unquote. He reported. Quote, I climbed up the bushes quicker than I had descended them. Arrived on top, I found the two people with whom I had come. They wished to interrogate me. This was futile. I was deaf and not about to hear them. It was not until 2 hours afterwards that the deafness left me and I was able to give an account of what I had seen, unquote. The Swedish naturist Peter Kalm also visited the falls in these years, dining at the fort en route and pausing to watch the work of the Indians, who would soon be complaining to the French government that horses were being used on the portage, depriving them of their livelihood. While Bonifans thought he may have made first gorge descent, Kalm offers proof a year or two earlier that Indians and even Europeans had been there before him. In the earliest account of the region, written in English, he tells of Indians descending into the foot of the falls after having been stranded on the island that divides the cataracts. And he himself sent 2 young Frenchmen to the bottom of the abyss to gather herbs, shells, and stones for him. The main fort, already used as a starting point for Indian raids on British settlements, also became a staging area for French military expeditions into the interior. Starting along the portage, the French troops began a string of outposts along Lake Erie and as far south as Fort Duquesne, at what is now Pittsburgh. The move sparked yet another conflict, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. While the British forces, including a young Virginia colonial militia officer named George Washington, campaigned to the south and suffered early setbacks in their attempts to strike northward toward the falls, efforts were being made to strengthen Niagara against the British threat from Oswego. Captain Pierre Pouchot expanded the fortifications at Fort Niagara. The labor was in vain. French domination of the Niagara frontier, which had started even before the English colonized Jamestown or landed at Plymouth Rock, was about to end. The French had not moved to settle the Niagara's banks merely to hold the portage. For them, it was a strategic point on a thoroughfare, a place that, if lost, could desolate Canada and forced France to abandon its New World colonies, as one report to the royal ministers noted. Aside from Joncaire, some traders and soldiers, those who came to Niagara, including Madame Cadillac and her companions, the first European women to reach the region as they traveled to join the founder of Detroit in 1701, were merely passing through. But the threat of a military loss at Niagara imperiled all the French holdings in the Great Lakes, not just the unsettled region at the falls. Fort Niagara was enlarged and redesigned along the classical lines of a Vauban-style fortress. The work progressing despite the comings and goings of throngs of Indians of a myriad of nations. French-inspired war parties headed out against the English, but the English efforts, led in New York by Sir William Johnson, were turning more of the nations and warriors against the French. As conflict along Niagara neared, and Fort Frontenac at the other end of Lake Ontario fell to a British army, The commander of Little Fort Niagara, Lieutenant Daniel de Joncaire, son of the former chief Indian agent and often referred to simply as Chabert, was ordered to abandon his post and reinforce the main fort with his Indian allies. In so doing, he burned the water-powered sawmill he had built just above the American Falls in 1757 to cut planks for a chapel at the fort and for 2 ships that were never finished. Finally, in 1759, the British reached Fort Niagara. Supported now by 1,500 Iroquois warriors, Brigadier General John Prideaux's 2,000-man force from Oswego landed unnoticed and unopposed and surrounded Pouchot's 600-man garrison. What followed, historian Brian Lee Dunnigan of Restored Old Niagara notes, was a classic European-style siege operation. While the cannons of the opposing forces hammered away at each other, English soldiers and sappers painstakingly advanced trenches toward the walls of the fort. After 19 days, they were within 100 yards of the battered fort. The only hope for the fort was a hastily organized relief force of French troops and Indians from the interior, which arrived at the Lake Erie entrance to the Niagara in a massive flotilla. The 1,600-man force moved quickly to the upper end of the portage and made their way toward the fort. At a place near modern-day Youngstown called La Belle Famille, probably a riverside shrine, the French relief force was routed by British regulars on July 24, 1759. The next day, all hope was lost. Pouchot surrendered the fort. The Battle of La Belle Famille ended French hopes in America. Communication with forts deeper in the continent was severed, and Detroit and other posts also would soon surrender. The era of British dominance at Niagara and through much of Canada had begun. John Stedman rebuilt Chabert's Mill, marking the return of commerce. Captain John Joseph Schlosser took command of the upper portage, where at least part of Chabert de Joncaire's little fort Niagara still stood, and built what became Fort Schlosser. The simple French fortifications at the lower end of the portage also were replaced by a British post. Disease and hardship reigned, though, until the French surrender at Montreal in 1760 allowed the British to turn their efforts westward. Fort Niagara became a staging area for those efforts, and in 1761, Sir William Johnson held peace conferences at the fort to win allegiance from the Indians formerly allied with the French. But the Indians' distrust of all the invasions of their lands would continue to cause trouble for the region's new masters. And at Niagara, more blood would be shed. End reading.